I didn't look back. My lungs burned with every frantic breath, my feet slipping on the cobblestones as I dodged a toppling cart of spilling grain. Dust choked the afternoon air, thick and suffocating, as screams and the clatter of galloping hooves echoed through the sprawling market. My only thought was survival, pushing through the panicked crowd, desperate to lose myself in the labyrinth of the lower city alleys. I rounded a sharp corner, chancing one quick glance over my shoulder to see if I was still being pursued, and, smack. I rebounded hard, stumbling backward. I hadn't hit a stone building. I hadn't hit a stray cart. I had slammed shoulder first into a wall of pure, unyielding solid muscle. Gasping, I looked up. And up. He was massive, towering over the panicked crowd like a monolith. He was draped in dark, immaculate royal velvet, a stark contrast to the grime of the market, with polished steel guards strapped to his broad shoulders. He hadn't so much as budged from the impact. Instead of moving aside or offering a hand, he simply looked down at me. His eyes were dark, piercing, and alight with a deeply infuriating, arrogant amusement. He looked at me as if I were a particularly entertaining speck of dust that had just blown into his path. "Watch where you are going." I snapped, the adrenaline boiling my fear into sudden, blazing anger. One of his dark eyebrows arched slowly. He didn't speak, just stood there, entirely unfazed by the riot breaking out mere streets away, blocking my only escape route. "Are you deaf or just incredibly stupid?" I barked, shoving my hands against his chest. It was like trying to push a mountain. "Move! You arrogant brute, you are blocking the alley." For a fraction of a second, a flicker of genuine shock crossed his stoic, handsome features, as if no one had ever dared speak to him that way in his entire life. Before he could recover or utter a single word, I shoved past him, my shoulder clipping his, and sprinted blindly into the shadows of the narrow alleyway, disappearing into the maze of the city. I didn't give him a second thought. I was too busy staying alive to care about a rude, overdressed giant with an ego problem. It would be a long time before I realized that the arrogant brute I had just cursed out in the middle of a dirt-stained street was none other than the supreme ruler of the empire. I had just shoved the Alpha King. Weeks bled into a quiet routine, the adrenaline of the market incident fading into a distant memory. When the stifling expectations of my family's estate grew to be too much, I retreated to my only sanctuary, a massive, ancient weeping willow situated far beyond our property lines. Its sweeping branches created a curtain of green, a secret haven where I could read, weave, and simply breathe in peace. Until the peace was broken. The heavy crunch of boots on the grass made me freeze, my book slipping from my lap. The willow branches parted, and there he stood. It was the brute from the market. This time, however, the dust and chaos were gone, replaced by an unmistakable aura of absolute authority. He wore no armor today, only a loose linen shirt and dark trousers, yet he commanded the space entirely. More shockingly, he was alone. Not a single guard flanked him. "You," I breathed, scrambling to my feet. "Me," he replied, a slow, dangerous smile curving his lips. He stepped into the dappled sunlight of my sanctuary, his gaze heavy and assessing. He introduced himself then, not as a wandering lord, but as the Alpha King of the Empire. He expected me to drop to my knees, to tremble, to apologize for my brazen disrespect in the city. He confessed that my fiery spirit had captivated him, and he had spent weeks tracking me down to court me. I didn't bow. Instead, my jaw tightened. "Your crown does not excuse your manners," I told him, looking him dead in the eye. I was completely unimpressed by the heavy gold signet ring on his finger or the power radiating from his stance. "You are rude. You are arrogant. And you rely far too much on a title to intimidate people into liking you." His smile faltered, replaced by genuine shock. "I have no interest in dating a warlord," I continued, turning my back to him to retrieve my book. "I want a genuine man. A man with a good heart. You can leave the way you came, Your Majesty." I expected his legendary temper. I expected to be dragged to the dungeons. What I did not expect was the low, rich sound of his laughter. Instead of being angry, the Alpha King was intrigued. That day marked the beginning of a relentless, baffling routine. Every single afternoon, the supreme ruler of the empire abandoned his throne and his war councils to visit my willow tree. Our dynamic was as absurd as it was constant. I utterly ignored him. I would sit leaning against the broad trunk of the tree, deeply engrossed in my books or weaving baskets, refusing to even look his way. And the king? The most feared man in the realm would simply sit cross-legged on the dirt and grass beside me, completely out of his element, doing nothing but watching me. He tried to win me over, arriving with gifts that would make noble women weep. He brought rare, glowing orchids from the furthest eastern provinces. He brought silks woven with silver thread. I politely pushed them aside and went back to my reading. Frustrated but undeterred, he began to try and show me his heart, attempting to bridge the massive gap between us. He wanted me to see the man beneath the crown. "You judge me for the armor I must wear," he said one afternoon, his deep voice softening as he watched my hands work the weaving loom. "I am ruthless to my enemies, yes. The empire requires a blade. But I am not a bad man to those I cherish." It was a beautiful sentiment, spoken with a vulnerability I hadn't thought him capable of. But the memory of our first chaotic encounter and the sheer arrogance of his pursuit still burned in my mind. I looked up from my loom, meeting his intense, pleading gaze. "My answer," I said smoothly, "remains no." The relentless afternoon visits under the weeping willow abruptly ceased. It wasn't because the king had conceded defeat, but because the empire finally demanded its ruler. A week later, the quiet of our countryside was shattered by the blare of brass horns. Royal messengers, clad in the king's crimson and gold, rode furiously through the village squares, unrolling heavy parchment scrolls. The decree they read was absolute and unyielding: the empire required a Luna. To secure the kingdom's future, a magnificent, week-long mating banquet was declared at the capital. By royal law, every unwed maiden aged 25 and older was summoned to attend. There were no exceptions. This announcement threw my family's estate into an absolute frenzy. My parents, who were ruthlessly ambitious and constantly clawing for higher status, saw this as their ultimate triumph. Their intense focus, as always, locked completely onto my half-sister, Lyra. It was easy to see why. Lyra possessed a delicate, ethereal beauty that made people stop in their tracks. Anyone observing our household would immediately assume a bitter, venomous rivalry existed between us, the classic, tragic tale of the favored golden child and the neglected outcast. But they would be entirely wrong. Lyra was my fiercest defender and my closest friend. While our parents fawned over her, obsessing over her silks and lecturing her on how to capture the king's eye, Lyra would quietly slip away to my room. She would hold my hands, sigh at the sheer exhaustion of it all, and tell me that I was just as worthy of a crown. There was absolutely no poison between us, only the suffocating, relentless pressure of our parents' boundless greed. When our carriage finally arrived at the royal palace on the first night of the banquet, the sheer scale of the empire's wealth stole the breath from my lungs. It was an intimidating fortress of carved white marble and towering spires. The great hall was impossibly opulent, boasting high vaulted ceilings that dripped with massive crystal chandeliers. The air was thick and overwhelming, heavy with the scent of roasted meats, exotic imported perfumes, and the nervous, vibrating anticipation of thousands of women. It was a sea of glittering jewels and rustling silk. I wanted no part of it. The moment we passed through the massive gilded doors, I slipped away from my parents' watchful eyes. Leaving Lyra to shine in the center of the room, I retreated, tucking myself into the deepest shadows at the very back of the hall behind a colossal stone pillar. I pulled my simple shawl tighter, praying to the fates that I would go entirely unnoticed. Then, the royal trumpet sounded. The Alpha King emerged from the high arches, ascending the marble steps to his elevated throne. A collective, awestruck gasp rippled through the endless sea of maidens. He was terrifyingly magnificent, draped in heavy formal regalia, a crown of dark, forged iron resting upon his brow. Slowly, calculatingly, he began to survey the room. And then, his gaze stopped. He looked past the jewels, past the front rows of nobility, straight into the shadows at the back of the hall. He found me. In that instant, the deafening, echoing roar of the banquet hall simply vanished. The sweeping orchestral music seemed to mute itself, fading into a dull, distant hum. The thousands of women standing between us melted away into a meaningless blur of color. Across that massive, impossible distance, his dark eyes locked onto mine. They burned with a terrifying recognition and an unmistakable, primal claim. He didn't move an inch. He didn't speak a single word. But the sheer, breathless intensity of his stare crossed the cavernous room and wrapped around me like a physical weight. I had told him no under the willow tree. His silent, burning gaze was telling me that my refusal was no longer acceptable. My parents were deeply ambitious, but they were not blind. Over the next few days of the banquet, they had noticed the impossible. They saw the way the Alpha King's gaze drifted over the glittering crowds, completely ignoring the rehearsed smiles of the nobility, only to lock onto the dark corners of the hall where I tried to hide. Panic set in. To them, my stubborn presence was a direct threat. They were terrified that my unique, quiet defiance would somehow eclipse Lyra's polished perfection and ruin her chances of becoming the Luna. So, they took drastic measures. On the eve of the final day, the night the king was to make his choice, I was dragged from my palace bed in the dead of night. Without a word of explanation, my parents packed my few belongings, shoved me into a cold carriage, and banished me back to our empty countryside home under the cover of darkness. Honestly, I could have kissed them. As the carriage wheels rattled against the cobblestones, carrying me further and further away from the towering, oppressive palace, a wave of profound, intoxicating relief washed over me. I leaned my head against the glass and smiled in the dark. I remembered our chaotic first meeting, his arrogant smirk in the market, and the heavy, suffocating pressure of his stare in the great hall. Escaping that world was an absolute blessing. Let him have his grand banquet. I was going back to my quiet life and my weeping willow. Back at the capital, however, the morning brought only heartbreak. When Lyra discovered my empty room, she was devastated. She didn't care about the glittering crown or the royal title, she cared about her sister. She stormed into our parents' suites, tears streaming down her face, screaming and fighting them. She demanded they send a royal carriage to bring me back immediately. But their ambition was absolute. They coldly silenced her, brushing off her tears, and ordered her to fix her dress and prepare to be chosen. Then came the climax of the week, the final day. The great hall was packed to the brim. The sweeping music swelled to a crescendo and then abruptly stopped. The Alpha King stood. Slowly, he descended the white marble steps of his throne to finally claim his Luna. The entire crowd held its collective breath. Thousands of women watched in awe and envy as he bypassed the front rows, walking past dukes and high-born ladies with brutal, unwavering purpose. He walked straight to the shadows behind the colossal stone pillar at the back of the room. But the shadows were empty. I was gone. The shift in the room was instantaneous and terrifying. The festive, joyous atmosphere evaporated in a heartbeat, replaced by a suffocating, freezing dread. The king's jaw clenched. His eyes snapped across the room, locking onto my family where they stood near the front. There would be no celebration that day. The banquet was halted. Under the Alpha's furious orders, my parents were immediately removed from the glittering hall and brought to his private chambers. The heavy oak doors slammed shut. My parents, realizing the catastrophic mistake they had made, fell to their knees on the cold stone floor, trembling like leaves in a winter storm. Under the king's lethal, quiet interrogation, they cracked. They confessed everything, how they had packed me away in the night, how they had tried to manipulate his choice. Stammering and desperate to save their own lives, my father offered to dispatch his fastest, most elite guards to ride out and drag me back to the palace immediately. The king looked down at them, a dark, dangerous fury radiating from his massive frame. "No one touches her," he growled, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that shook the very walls of the chamber. "I will go myself." I was thoroughly enjoying the profound quiet of my banishment when the ground outside my window began to tremble. I peeked through the dusty curtains of my childhood bedroom, and my heart plummeted squarely into my stomach. A column of elite royal cavalry, their steel armor gleaming violently in the late afternoon sun, was thundering up the dirt road toward our humble estate. And at the very head of the formation, riding a massive warhorse with a face like a thundercloud, was the Alpha King himself. Panic, blinding and absolute, took over. I couldn't face him. I couldn't deal with his wrath, his demands, or the heavy, burning weight of that stare I remembered from the Great Hall. So, I did the only logical thing a desperate woman could do. I sprinted across the room, threw myself into bed, yanked the heavy wool blankets all the way up to my chin, and decided to play deathly ill. A moment later, the front doors banged open. My parents, who had scrambled back from the capital in his terrifying wake, began to stammer apologies in the hallway. The king cut them off with a single, booming command. He didn't just ask for space, he demanded that my parents, the guards, and every single servant vacate the property immediately. He wanted absolute, total privacy. The silence that fell over the house as everyone frantically fled the grounds was deafening. Then came the heavy, slow thud of his boots walking down the narrow hallway. The door creaked open. He stepped into my tiny, dusty bedroom, filling the space entirely. I squeezed my eyes shut and let out a pitiful, rattling, wet cough for good measure. "Your Majesty," I croaked weakly, trying to sound as though I were hovering at death's door. "I am terribly sick. You must leave at once before you catch my plague." I cracked one eye open just a fraction. The king wasn't recoiling in horror. He wasn't backing away. He was smirking. Slowly, deliberately, he unbuckled his massive broadsword and let it clatter heavily onto the floorboards. He dragged a rickety, undersized wooden chair to the side of my bed, turned it around, and sat down. "Is that so?" he murmured, his dark eyes dancing with wicked amusement. "Then I shall stay and nurse you back to health." I stopped coughing, staring at him in sheer disbelief. But before I could formulate a protest, he completely shattered my defenses. Right there, in that cramped, unremarkable room, the terrifying Alpha King dropped his imposing persona entirely. He leaned forward, resting his large, calloused hands on his knees, and spoke with a blunt, breathtaking honesty. He didn't whisper, he declared his feelings boldly and loudly. He told me he didn't care about the thousands of flawless, glittering noblewomen in his great hall. He didn't want a perfectly rehearsed political pawn to sit quietly and look pretty beside his throne. "I want the woman who shoved me in a filthy market," he stated, his voice a low, vibrating rumble of absolute certainty. "I want the fierce, stubborn girl who defied me under the willow tree. And I am not leaving this house until she is mine." My heart did a traitorous flutter, but my pride was still stubbornly intact. I refused to admit I was lying. Thus began a completely absurd, hilarious test of wills, the 5-day siege. I stubbornly kept up the sick act for 5 agonizingly long days, refusing to leave the bed. And the king? The king called my bluff. The most powerful, feared man in the entire empire, a man who commanded legions and conquered nations, turned my quiet home into his personal campsite. Peeking through my window, I watched in absolute shock as the supreme ruler stripped off his royal velvet tunic to brutally chop firewood in our overgrown yard. I listened to him fetching water from the old stone well. And every single night, rather than demanding a soft bed or returning to his luxurious palace, the Alpha King folded his massive, aching frame into that tiny, uncomfortable wooden chair, sleeping beside me in the dusty dark to make sure his plague-ridden, stubborn girl was safe. By the 3rd day, the sheer absurdity of my plague was impossible to maintain. My fake coughs eventually turned into reluctant chuckles as I watched the supreme ruler of the empire stubbornly attempt to boil root vegetable stew over my hearth. The icy hostility between us finally melted away, replaced by a quiet, comfortable truce. I stopped pretending to sleep. We began to talk. Truly talk. The conversation started slowly but soon stretched deep into the candlelight of the evenings. I didn't hold back my opinions to spare his royal ego. We debated territorial laws, argued over the mechanics of agricultural reform in the neglected outer provinces, and discussed the desperately needed establishment of public education. As I laid out a strategy for crop rotation that would prevent famine in the eastern farmlands, I watched his expression shift entirely. The indulgent amusement vanished, replaced by profound, genuine awe. The king was stunned. He realized then that I wasn't merely a fiery spirit with a sharp tongue. I understood the intricate, heavy machinery of his empire. He was looking at me not just as a defiant woman he wanted to claim, but as a strategic mind. As an equal. As a true queen. The turning point, the moment the final wall between us crumbled, happened on a quiet, rain-swept afternoon. I was sitting up against the pillows, quietly working a needle and thread through a torn piece of embroidered linen. The king sat in his usual rickety chair, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, watching the swift, practiced movements of my hands with absolute fascination. "It requires a delicate touch," I murmured, amused by his intense focus. "Something you lack, I imagine." He raised a dark, challenging brow. "Show me." Smiling, I handed him the scrap of fabric and the tiny silver needle. It was genuinely comical to witness. This massive, battle-hardened warlord, whose scarred hands were built to grip broadswords and command warhorses, awkwardly attempted to pinch a needle no bigger than a thorn. He frowned in deep concentration, fumbling clumsily with the thread. With a soft sigh, I shifted closer to the edge of the bed. I reached out and gently placed my hands over his to guide him. The moment my skin touched his, the world seemed to stop. The gentle, steady patter of the rain against the glass faded away. The air in the tiny, dusty bedroom suddenly grew impossibly thick, humming with a sudden, electric heat. The light-hearted banter died instantly in my throat. I looked up, and his dark eyes were already fixed on mine. The eye contact was prolonged, heavy, and completely stripping away every last defense I had built against him. In that suspended moment, the royal title simply vanished. There was no Alpha King, and there was no rebellious country maiden. There was only a man and a woman in a quiet room, their hands intertwined over a scrap of linen. I saw it then, the truth I had been fighting all along. He wasn't the arrogant brute from the market. Beneath the terrifying armor and the heavy crown was a man who was fiercely protective, incredibly patient, and deeply, undeniably caring. I had fallen in love with him. The tension in the air pulled taut, snapping the last thread of my resistance. The needle slipped from his fingers, completely forgotten on the quilt. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his large hands, lacing his calloused fingers through mine. His gaze dropped to my lips, his breathing shallow. He leaned in, bridging the final, agonizing distance between us. When his lips finally met mine, it was not the demanding, forceful kiss of a conqueror. It was breathtakingly gentle, deeply passionate, and desperately tender. It was a hard-earned, beautiful surrender that sealed my fate forever. When we finally left my quiet childhood home, the world had entirely shifted on its axis. The Alpha King did not order me into the carriage, he simply swept me up into his powerful arms, holding me flush against his chest as he carried me out into the fading afternoon light. He was dressed not in the stiff, formal velvet of the palace, but in the rugged, dark riding leathers and steel bracers of a true warrior king, the very attire that made him look most like himself. We rode back to the capital side by side. I was no longer a rebellious subject, and he was no longer an unreachable monarch. We returned as equals. The capital erupted into a deafening roar of jubilation the moment the royal gates opened. The days that followed were a beautiful, sweeping blur of music, color, and unimaginable grandeur. I was bathed in scented oils and draped in the finest, heaviest silks the empire had to offer, adorned with jewels that caught the light like captured stars. The great hall, once a place of suffocating anxiety, was transformed into a breathtaking sanctuary for our grand ceremony. Standing before the highest lords and ladies of the realm, the Alpha King took the heavy, forged iron crown of the Luna in his hands. His dark eyes never left mine as he personally placed it upon my head, the cool metal a heavy, grounding promise. I was no longer just Elara, I was the Luna of the Empire. Yet, before the celebrations could truly begin, there was a final, dark shadow to address. My parents were brought before the throne. They fell to their knees on the polished marble, trembling so violently they could barely speak. They expected the executioner's block. Deceiving the king and attempting to sabotage his mating choice was an offense of the highest treason. I looked at the man beside me, knowing his legendary ruthlessness, and quietly placed my hand over his. I asked for mercy. The great hall held its breath. The king looked down at the groveling pair, his jaw tight. Then, he let out a slow breath and nodded. He granted them a full royal pardon, banishing them back to the countryside with their lives intact. In that single, shocking act of forgiveness, he proved to me, and to the entire kingdom, that the harsh, unforgiving warlord had truly changed. As my parents scrambled away in disbelief, a figure broke from the crowd of nobles, heedless of royal protocol. It was Lyra. Tears of absolute, unrestrained joy streamed down her beautiful face as she rushed the steps of the dais. I stepped down and caught her in a fierce, breathless embrace. We held each other tightly, laughing and crying all at once. I promised her right then that she would never be pushed aside or bartered by our parents again. She would have a prestigious, permanent, and happy place by my side in the royal court. The celebrations raged into the night, but eventually, the king and I slipped away from the noise and the glittering crowds. We walked out onto the high, sweeping stone balcony of the highest tower. The empire stretched out endlessly beneath us, thousands of city lights flickering like scattered diamonds in the dark. The cool night wind caught my veil, and I felt the king step up close behind me. He wrapped his massive arms around my waist, pulling my back flush against his chest, resting his chin on the top of my head. He looked out over the vast, unconquered lands he ruled, but his thoughts were far away from wars and politics. He leaned down, his lips brushing against my ear. I have conquered armies, he whispered, his voice a low, reverent rumble in the quiet night. I have broken sieges and brought entire nations to their knees. But my greatest victory, the hardest battle I ever fought, was winning the heart of the stubborn girl under the willow tree. I turned in his arms, smiling as I reached up to cup his face. I kissed my king under the stars of our empire. And that concludes our epic tale. Thank you for listening and letting yourself be swept away by Elara and the king's journey. If you loved this story, make sure to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. I would love to hear from you. Would you have kept up the fake sickness and made the Alpha King chop firewood for a few more days, or would you have given in sooner? If you love deep, immersive storytelling featuring strong, consenting adults and fiercely protective alphas who look far better in rugged leathers than stiff formal wear, be sure to subscribe to the channel. There are many more romantic adventures, grand empires, and unforgettable characters waiting to be told. Thank you again for watching. Until next time, keep dreaming of epic romances, and I will see you in the next story.